Good afternoon. Welcome to Broadband Breakfast Live Online. The only thing we forgot is the lighting. We are very happy to be here at Clyde's of Gallery Place in Washington, D.C. I'm Drew Clark, editor and publisher of Broadband Breakfast. The lighting will adjust, never fear. And I'm very happy to be here with one of our panelists for our discussion that we're going to have today on harnessing cryptocurrency. This is a topic that we haven't ventured into before. We at Broadband Breakfast cover broadband infrastructure. We cover broadband's impact. We also cover big tech and the significant ways in which the internet impacts our society and technology companies. And cryptocurrency has obviously become more and more pressing, both as a technology, a financial instrument, and as a policy question. So we're tackling the topic today, and we freely admit we're not experts at this, but that's why we have other people here with us to help educate and guide the discussion. Our motto at Broadband Breakfast is better broadband, better lives. We have focused intently on broadband infrastructure and how new waves of funding are going to impact that. But we never stop thinking as well about the way these tools impact our society. And before I turn to our panelists, I just want to remind everyone that we are here every Wednesday at 12 noon Eastern time. That is to say, we are live online every Wednesday. Once a month, the second Wednesday of the month, we are here now at Clyde's of Gallery Place. We encourage you to check out our programming, look and see what events we have coming up, and we invite you to sign up and join with us. We also want to give a shout out to our sponsors, without whom we wouldn't be able to do this and other programs. They include Utopia Fiber, Lit Communities, Broadband.money, Broadband Now, Lightbox, Powerhouse Management, Render Networks, Samsung Electronics America, the California Emerging Technology Fund, and Positron Access. Thank you to each of you for your contributions and allowing us to keep our programming going. We're going to be back next week live online with a show about the state's role in the broadband infrastructure, and we've got exciting programs after that. But without any further ado, let's open it up to our panelists. Our first speaker will be Carol Goforth, who joins us remotely from Arkansas, I'm presuming, where Carol is the Clayton N. Little Professor of Law at the University of Arkansas in Fayetteville. And she is a dynamo of knowledge and interest in cryptocurrency. She, in fact, is the author of the treatise on the subject, Regulation of Crypto Transactions. I believe the second edition is coming out later this year. So we look forward to hearing first from Carol to orient us a little bit on, what exactly is cryptocurrency, the blockchain, and why it's become such an important topic for policymakers. She'll be followed by Jennifer Schulp. Jennifer is the Director of Financial Regulation Studies at Cato Institute's Center for Monetary and Financial Alternatives. And Jennifer just concluded a wonderful 4-part series on the regulation of cryptocurrency. I learned so much from watching these 4 one-hour sessions, really getting at some of the regulatory conflicts that are happening right now in Washington and globally as well. Following Jennifer, we're going to hear as well from Matthew Snyder. Matthew is Senior Vice President of Strategy and Business Development at Centratech, and he's been focused on broadband affordability and adoption. So he's actually a former guest on our Broadband Breakfast Live Online, and he's been an active participant in the blockchain economy. So he is well equipped to talk about the way the blockchain is impacting broadband infrastructure. So with that, let's go ahead and turn it over to you, Carol, to tell us a little bit about this world that we're talking about here today.
I'm delighted to be here and delighted to tackle what is a huge topic. My introduction will be very high level because obviously we are subject to time constraints. So with that in mind, what are crypto assets? Crypto assets are nothing more than a digital string of numbers. They have no tangible existence, and they have value, a lot of value. If you look at sources like CoinMarketCap, today's total market value of all of these strings of numbers exceeded $2 trillion. So why do they have value? They have value because people say they have value. People agree that they have value. That may seem like a very hard thing when you're just thinking about a string of numbers, but really, what value does a dollar bill have? You can't eat it or sleep with it or do anything fun with it except spend it. And the original function of crypto assets was, in fact, as a substitute for government-backed money, for funds. It was designed to free us from government intrusion, government oversight, government investigation into our private financial affairs. It was designed to avoid the need for financial intermediaries that add delay and expenses and create problems for 1.7 million adults around the world who are unbanked or underbanked and don't have access to the financial intermediaries that many of us in developed nations such as the United States take for granted. So these crypto assets were things that had potential, the untold improvement for human lives. And it was made possible not only by the development of cryptographic tools that enabled them to stay secure, and the spread and acceptance of the internet and of market transactions over the internet, but also by the development of blockchain technology, which was a vehicle for having time-stamped aggregations of transactions added in a chain to a distributed ledger. That is, computers in a network that agreed to participate for a certain kind of asset, such as the Bitcoin network, or the Ethereum network, or the Ripple network for XRP. All of the computers in that network would have access to the complete record of prior transactions. And so you could tell who owned at any time a given asset and whether or not they owned it enough and controlled it enough to transfer it. They wouldn't know the exact identity of people because everybody was doing this pseudonymously, but they would be able to verify using distributed ledger technology, of which blockchain is an example, to verify that these transactions were legitimate. I'm not going to go into the various proof of work, proof of stake consensus protocols, but I'm going to tell you that we now have a decent string of successes proving that blockchain technology does work. It is not susceptible to unilateral change or embezzlement by a single person. It works, it has value, people have accepted it, major institutions have accepted it, and it has moved far beyond the original limited use as a substitute for currency, and now also includes a range of other potential functions, including serving as a ledger of transactions for ownership of assets, for membership in a limited group, for tracing of particular assets along a distribution route, for tokenizing regular securities such as stocks or bonds. There are so many different potential uses that make this particular technology exciting and valuable and something that is moving so incredibly rapidly, but also creates a world of potential abuses, a world where money launderers can come in and hide their transactions relying on the lack of oversight, where criminal enterprises can use crypto assets to fund illegal enterprises or to pay ransomware to make it harder to trace. Cross-border transactions are possible that also interfere with the ability to prevent criminal elements or to prevent economic blockades from terrorist organizations and groups from being as effective as they might. There are fraudulent offers, there are scams, there is market manipulation. And when a market of crypto assets gains a valuation in excess of trillions of dollars, there's also the potential for negative impact on the financial markets. For those reasons, regulators have been very interested in making sure that crypto assets are not used to undermine their potential regulatory mission. So in the United States, both the federal and the state level, we have a number of different regulators very concerned. We have FinCEN, our Financial Crimes Enforcement Network, that has the task of limiting money laundering and funding of illegal enterprises, very active in overseeing the use of crypto as a substitute for currency. And in fact, it regulates businesses that help transfer crypto from one person to another as a business as money transmitters. There goes the idea that this is going to be truly private because you've got Bank Secrecy Act requirements being imposed. You have the Securities and Exchange Commission and state securities administrators as well, overseeing the use of these as a way of marketing speculative investments that the Securities and SEC tend to treat as securities and want to be registered or marketed only under an exemption, which often limits who can actually buy the investments. The SEC also regulates crypto businesses that operate as exchanges and is very desperately trying to assert its jurisdiction over that. When you have futures or derivatives, the Commodities Futures Trading Commission gets involved. The IRS gets involved when they think that crypto is being used to help people avoid paying taxes. You have the Department of the Treasury concerned when you have the market growing so big that there is a risk of financial disruption. You have the Consumer Finance Protection Bureau worried about fraud. You have some other federal regulators and international regulators and state regulators. And the growing challenge is finding a balance between the legitimate need to protect the public, the investors, and our financial structures and systems against abuse, but also the desire to protect and encourage legitimate entrepreneurs. I am deeply concerned that to date, my opinion is we have gone heavy-handed on the regulation, and we've forgotten the part about fomenting and encouraging technological development. I think that creates problems, but in 5 minutes, that's about all I have time to provide for my overview. So Jennifer, I'm going to turn this over to you.
Well, thank you very much, Carol, and let's turn it over without further ado to Jennifer to give us some context from the work you've been doing in this subject.
Great, and Carol, that was a great overview. I don't have much to add on that front. I certainly couldn't have said it better myself. I wanted to highlight a couple of things that Carol said and kind of point them out more specifically. The first is that we often talk and we hear about crypto and blockchain in the same sentence. Crypto and blockchain regulation, crypto and blockchain development, crypto and blockchain go together. While it's true that blockchain supports crypto, crypto and blockchain need to be thought of as two separate things when we're talking about regulation. It's entirely possible to have blockchain applications and applications of blockchain that have nothing to do with crypto. My favorite example of that is hearing stories about how blockchain can tell us where our food comes from and where it's been. You can have a ledger that has nothing to do with a crypto asset. So it's important to draw the distinction between the two when we're thinking about them and not to lump them together. And then I'd like to draw another distinction because we often talk about crypto as this monolith. Crypto assets do X, or crypto assets should be regulated in Y way. And crypto is a pretty broad and diverse universe underneath this one term. There are any number of functions that a crypto token or a crypto asset can undertake, different purposes for them existing. We hear a lot about Bitcoin. We also hear now about such things called stable coins, which are meant to keep a stable value as opposed to Bitcoin, which is up and down, as we've seen a lot recently. But there's applications for crypto assets beyond those. So when we think about crypto and blockchain, we need to be very careful not to be painting these things with a broad brush, particularly when we think about regulation. And to turn to regulation, I think we're at a very exciting time. Carol pointed out really the problems that we think about when we're thinking about what regulation should solve. Consumer protection to some degree, preventing bad actors from taking part in the system or taking advantage of others. And these are problems that we have and we've thought about with respect to cash, securities, derivatives. And we've met these challenges and thought about them, sometimes met them better than others. And there's always room for improvement in that space. But the challenges that we're facing with crypto and thinking about them are how to apply old rules to a new technology and new technologies that might not fit those old rules so well. And that is the challenge that Congress is facing right now, and the challenge that every single one of that regulatory litany that Carol listed is thinking about. Why is that important for people that might just be interested in buying some Bitcoin or might be interested in investing in some blockchain technology or some company that deals with these cutting edge technological issues? Well, it's very important because the regulatory landscape that we put forth now will affect the development of these entrepreneurs and innovation in the future. There's been conversations, particularly on the Hill, but elsewhere over the past year plus, asking what can crypto do for us? What is the benefit of crypto? And sometimes you get very satisfying answers to that. Sometimes you get answers from enthusiastic crypto proponents that point to something that you think might not happen in the future. And you've seen reactions from folks on the Hill to that, thinking, if that can't happen, crypto must be a scam, or we should shut this down immediately because I don't know what good it's going to do for me. And it's very important at this stage that we're thinking more about not harming innovation and potential than about knowing exactly where this technology is going to take us in the future. And I think that's an important conversation that anyone that's interested in this space should be having, but a conversation that we really should be having at the regulatory level that's happening in some places a lot more efficiently and effectively than others. And I think we'll talk a lot more about that today, but I think this is a great place to kind of frame the discussion.
Wonderful.
And start.
No, wonderful. Thank you so much for that dive into the regulatory aspect that is so vital. And as you've pointed out, kind of heat up in the last year and a half. So many questions on my end, but let's get another voice into the perspective here. Matthew, tell us a little bit about some of your perspective on crypto, the blockchain, and its impact, particularly on the broadband world that we're all a part of.
Yeah, thanks again, Drew. And I just want to make a point here that a year ago, 2 years ago, it would have been anathema to have a conversation about this at a broadband breakfast. People would not have attended. They would have thought you were probably kind of crazy or trying to sell them something. And yet here we are. Bitcoin has died like 25 times now. People have said this is going away. The cat is out of the bag, and it's super exciting. This is really a testament to the power of this technology, where we thought originally that this was all for crime and for drug use and for illicit activity. And now you've got large financial institutions, full foreign governments that are coming in and backing these sorts of technologies to be able to help proliferate their own agendas as a company or a country. Again, when did Bitcoin come around? 2009. This was in the midst of the worst financial crisis that the country had seen since the Great Depression. And what's really amazing now is the government is trying to figure out what to do, right? And quite frankly, they're pretty terrified because 1 month in the crypto space is basically like 1 year in what we would see normally in terms of regulatory activity and all these kinds of things. So there's this crazy movement of speed, and both government and law have not necessarily been known for being fast acting organizations or ecosystems. And so there's going to be a lot of interesting ways that these are now being dealt with. And I definitely agree that there's got to be ways that we don't hinder or hamper the technology and innovation that's going on because it's doing so many good things. And I can circle that around with broadband, where at CenturyTech, we work to bring affordable broadband to affordable housing, senior care facilities, public housing, and so on and so forth. Being able to connect people is a very, very important piece of how technology is proliferating today. And right now we get a lot of discussion about people who are unserved or who are underserved. And I hear people already in the chat talking about Althea, which is an organization that uses community mesh networks and blockchain technology to not only provide strong broadband to people, but also provide a mechanism where those people can earn money for unused bandwidth. I'll say it again. You can earn money when your Wi-Fi is not actually being used for your own internet purposes. That is something that the blockchain technology can do for us, where we can have mechanisms to build wealth for individuals who may not have been able to do before. And in other ways, there's organizations like Helium, which is another great project that's come about. It's a little bit bigger, but again, it's all based on people operating nodes, consensus mechanisms, and a lot of different technological pieces that are being brought together to provide these kinds of connectivity where connectivity was not there prior. And again, large organizations who have spent a lot of time digging fiber, bringing it to every home, are going to have a really hard time when all of a sudden those waves are being passed over by completely different technologies, and people are going to get the exact same customer experience. And this all translates into things like Web3 and NFTs and democratization, which I know we'll get into later, but I'll pause there and we can move forward with other questions.
So thank you again, Matthew, for being part of this conversation. So my first question, I really appreciate the way, Carol, you kind of kicked the legs out of one of the questions I had by saying, why is this valuable? It's valuable because people believe it has value. Like the critics, the people who say, oh, like this is based on nothing, like there's no underlying value. And of course, what is the US dollar based on? Since we closed the gold window, based on nothing. There's no underlying commodity by which Bitcoin or another cryptocurrency is value. But I want to get at something I haven't heard as much of from the three of you, which is the decentralized nature, the fact that there is no necessary intermediary, or at least that's the theory, right? And so I want to just probe on that a little bit, right? On some of your panels that you conducted, Jennifer, there were some critics who said, well, actually there are intermediaries, and some people cited miners as being an intermediary. You need to kind of use a miner to get access to the blockchain. Obviously, this takes financial transactions potentially out of the hands of the central banks, which is kind of part of its libertarian attraction. But what for all three of you, what is the nature of the alleged decentralization? Is it truly decentralized, or are there holes in that kind of way of thinking about the blockchain? Let's start with you, Carol.
It really depends on which network you're talking about. Some are more centralized and some are more decentralized. You can have a system that is set up that not all of your computers that have the same program are given equal power. You can have what are known as validator nodes or master nodes or trusted nodes. A good example of that is Ripple's XRP, which uses master nodes or validators to have the sole authorization to both approve changes to the underlying protocol, but also to approve transactions before they are added to the blockchain. Or something more like Bitcoin that has no business. I mean, one of the things that is hard for people to wrap their heads around is we don't even know who put that blockchain out there. It is free to anyone. Nobody is making money off of that blockchain being out there. That was a gift. And the people that have decided that they are going to be miners, when you started out and the protocol was new, that was kids in their basement and in their garage that were acting as, okay, that was Matthew. That was not the big centralized bank that is subject to regulation and is required to report every transaction of more than $10,000 and anything that looks suspicious and collect all of your identifying information and maintain those records. If you come from a libertarian mindset and a perspective that the government is not the solution, it is the problem, then that notion of not having big banks, big business, and big brother overseeing everything is something that a lot of these blockchains, but not all, a lot of these blockchains offered. So that was the notion behind it. And it works differently in practice, depending on the protocols and the computer programming.
Jennifer, what's your take on this?
Yeah, I mean, I admit I come from the libertarian background on this. I think my affiliation gives that away. But I think it's worth adding that the decentralization does depend on what we're talking about, but very little of it, even when we're talking about a more centralized blockchain or a more centralized crypto product, has the characteristics of what we think of as a true intermediary that's regulated today. You don't usually bring a securities action against a computer. You would bring it against a person or an entity. And even where you can find centralization in a lot of these systems, it's not the type of centralization that our laws have set up to look to someone to have liability for. So it's kind of an exciting time in that, and that it's worth rethinking about how you regulate intermediaries, how you regulate centralization, whether it is in fact the right thing to be doing on any of these circumstances. I'd like to say that might have an effect on how we regulate all of these transactions and not just blockchain crypto ones. I might be a little optimistic on that front, but it's even where we're talking about a more centralized technology, it often does not fit very well into the buckets that we've created already for regulation.
Okay. Matthew, my twist for you is, were you a Bitcoin miner? Are you still a Bitcoin miner? How does one go about doing that? Just for the dumb question I get to ask.
Yeah, so when I was 16, 17, I had a computer running and it ran a program, and every once in a while it would pop a little Bitcoin in there. What really happens is it's a consensus mechanism that provides you a fee for basically validating transactions on the blockchain to make sure that it propagates and keeps going and going and going. Back then, those were all, very micro pieces of Bitcoin, and they turned into one or two, and then you buy and sell as the market continues, of course. But that's really how it goes. And again, to their points that I think is really important, for us, decentralization is a spectrum. There are lots of different places where people can land on that. The central bank probably sitting over here in the more centralized one, and something like Cardano, which is the most decentralized blockchain out there, where not a single entity or group of entities can actually take down that ecosystem. Again, it's a spectrum. So it's important for us to think of where that spectrum exists and how different applications exist on top of it. And that's one other thing too, as we kind of get into this deeper, it's not so much the cryptocurrency piece, it's the foundation of the applications that you can build on top of the blockchain. Like Helium, for example, will utilize the Ethereum blockchain or Polygon network to manage the connections that it's providing for its own validators. I think somebody posted in the chat about Althea using MakerDAO to partner on validating transactions or on some of their internal logistics. So it's really about how you use those now intermediary applications to go build and proliferate other organizations and applications that everybody's going to be really excited to use.
Well, I definitely want to get to that, but before we do, since we do have Jennifer here, and you so nicely framed your series of events around this question of blockchain and cryptocurrency can be seen as a currency, it can be seen as a commodity, or it can be seen as a security or something else, which obviously lends then to, is it naturally regulated, if it is regulated at all, by the Commodities Futures Trading Commission as a commodity would, or a derivatives commodity would be, or by a bank, right? Or by the Securities and Exchange Commission. Could you just speak briefly, Jennifer, about what those three agencies or groups of agencies have done or are doing with crypto in the United States?
Oh, sure. It's hard to give a brief.
I know.
It's hard to give a brief one to that.
It is very hard, but particularly the CFTC and the SEC.
Yeah, so we've seen, and this is actually an interesting area because it's a breakdown that's very US specific,
right?
Where we have an entity that handles securities and an entity that regulates derivatives, commodities and derivatives. And the SEC and the CFTC have taken different approaches to regulating crypto. The CFTC has basically announced that most crypto assets are commodities, and therefore there's no direct regulatory authority for the CFTC over it. But the CFTC regulates crypto derivatives and is asking for the ability to regulate crypto exchanges, which is not necessarily already given to it in its rules. The SEC, on the other hand, has taken kind of a maximalist position over crypto and has announced essentially that almost all crypto assets are securities and therefore need to be regulated by the SEC. That's at odds with what the CFTC has said, and it's a very different regime to be a security versus a commodity. Securities require a lot of disclosure, a lot of different requirements. On top of that, if you're not going for disclosure, you have to meet a lot of hurdles in order to be exempt from the disclosure regime. And it's not at all clear, A, that the SEC is correct, but B, even if the SEC were correct that crypto assets are securities, that they fit into this disclosure regime that the SEC has created.
Right.
The financial disclosures, the disclosures about who's managing the company, the disclosure about who works for the company. None of that's particularly applicable when you're talking about Bitcoin or Ethereum.
So thank you. Carol, what are your reactions to that? And is this dilemma putting the United States in a disadvantageous position relative to the rest of the world that maybe isn't as, boxed up over who regulates what?
I agree with what Jennifer said, that the problem is the CFTC is saying it's a commodity. The SEC is saying it's a security. FinCEN says it's currency, and the IRS says, no, I get more money. It's property, all at the same time. And actually, you can have something that is a commodity and is a security. The issue is what happens when you have something that says, okay, comply with it this way and comply with it this way too. And the issue of where exchanges fall is really problematic. On January 26th, and this is a response to one of the questions that was like, give me an example of an overreach. You've got a definition of exchange in the Securities Act of 1934 that talks about a marketplace or a facility. And if you create one and if you maintain and operate it, you're an exchange. Well, we have, as of January 26, a proposed regulation that says, well, it's not just a trading facility, and it's not just if you organize and maintain it, it's if you make it available. And it not only includes a facility, it includes a computer protocol program. What an overreach. It is buried in a 642-page notice of proposed rulemaking that does not even mention crypto or digital assets, but could have a profound impact on the SEC's approach to requiring that these exchanges regulate or not do business in the United States. And the real impact is that there is a huge pressure, not just to not do business here, but to protect American investors by not letting them decide for themselves whether or not this is a risk they want to take. And that, to my mind, is a very clear example of regulatory overreach that is likely to harm the American investors and is likely to push technology and entrepreneurs away from our country in a way that is not optimal for anyone, other than folks who like large jurisdiction for the SEC.
Matthew, do you have any thoughts on the US versus other countries because of the regulatory question?
Yeah, and you've got some countries who've said this is our national currency, and you've got countries like Russia and China that said, no, it's banned. And they've done it, 6 or 7 times now? I think this is people who don't understand something, who are taking laws that are anachronistic in nature, very old, and saying, hey, these buckets apply because we can't think of other buckets to put them into at the moment, and we don't have the time or the effort. So we're just going to put them in these buckets and hope that they work. And the truth is, the very fun truth is, all it takes is a single VPN for me to go reroute any other transactions to any other part of the country or the world, and the government can't really do anything about it. So there is just a very big lack of being able to control this, and it's freaking them out.
It's not that they can't do anything about it, because if they have assets here or correspondent bank accounts, they can seize the funds that are here. And in fact, the US is a very large market.
Mm-hmm.
And so they can do some things, they just can't do it effectively. And once
Right.
you've said it's illegal, then you can't also have the regulations that would actually protect your citizens, which is why I think that the approach that's been taken is so uneven and problematic. And sorry for interrupting.
No, Jennifer,
Yeah.
go.
And I'm just going to throw out, I think one of the things that Carol was referring to was exactly the SEC has been reluctant and has completely denied access to American investors for a Bitcoin ETF.
ETF being.
An ETF being an exchange traded fund, which you can kind of think about as a mutual fund that's more efficient and costs less, which is there's more complicated behind it, but it's the easiest way to access, get exposure to something without owning it directly yourself. So right now, if you want to invest in Bitcoin, you can do three things. You can buy Bitcoin directly, which for Matthew, probably not a big deal. I think he knows how to do it. But it's not the most simple thing in the world to do. And there's security concerns. There's concerns about picking the right exchange to do it from. It's much more complicated than going on your app and buying the stock, for example. So you can buy Bitcoin directly. You can buy a Bitcoin into a Bitcoin fund, but it's not exchange traded, which means that it's less efficient. And it doesn't track the price of Bitcoin as well. And it's a little bit harder to get your hands on. If you want to buy a new issuance, you have to be wealthy enough to do so. Otherwise, you have to wait until those shares have been held long enough by the wealthy people and then traded on the secondary market. It's, again, a little complicated. And it's not the best way to get access to Bitcoin. And the third way is that the SEC has said you can buy into a Bitcoin futures ETF. That's a crazy proposition to me. A Bitcoin futures ETF allows you exposure to the Bitcoin futures market. That is definitely not the Bitcoin market in the first instance. And futures markets are generally not markets that I participate in, that you participate in, because futures markets are complicated and expensive.
And volatile, right?
And they can be volatile. And for something like Bitcoin, they're probably pretty volatile. But holding Bitcoin through a futures ETF is just a recipe for high fees and declining value if you hold it over any period of time.
Okay.
But the SEC won't approve a Bitcoin futures ETF or a Bitcoin ETF because they're concerned that the Bitcoin market is too dangerous for retail investors. But the Bitcoin futures market relies on the same Bitcoin market that the SEC is worried about.
So they're offering these more complicated alternatives, whether banning or not banning, but trying to restrict.
Yeah, trying to restrict access. And the thing is that to get back to the international point, I realize this is one that hits close to home. I'm very passionate about this one today. But many other countries have allowed Bitcoin ETFs to operate, including our neighbors to the north, Canada.
Right.
And they've been operating with no major issue. And what is happening is that large institutional players that want to offer a Bitcoin ETF are going to other countries to do so. Those other countries' rules and regulations then will have more of an effect on the Bitcoin market, the Bitcoin products that are available, and the US starts to lose out on the opportunity to shape that regulatory regime.
And it's kind of like the analogy, and I might have heard this on your series of events, Jennifer, to GDPR, the general data privacy rule regime in the European Union. That's kind of by default become the privacy regime for the world, including the United States. Is something or anything similar happening with EU or other countries that are driving forward?
I think we're not at the point yet where we can say that the US has kind of fallen completely behind on this. But there are other countries, the EU's moving forward. There are other countries that are having more of a conversation and having more of an effect on the larger regulatory regimes here. The US is always going to have some say. We're a huge market. And when the US finally weighs in, I wouldn't want to say that we won't have an effect, because we will.
Right.
But the early regulatory adoption here changes the flow of innovation, changes the opportunity for the technology. And the US has been, let's say, sitting this out to some degree, but with the SEC's most recent aggressive stance in this space is pushing some of this development offshore and into other regulatory regimes.
Let's get to some of the questions that you are asking. Thank you for them. Keep them coming. The most recent one by Bob Boucher, I hope I've got that pronunciation right. Why does the blockchain appear to take a great amount of electrical power? And Matthew has helpfully answered on the chat, because it requires computational power drawn from the power grid. We are beginning to see lots of stories about the, allegedly anti-green impact of Bitcoin and the blockchain. And let's see if Carol, Jennifer, Matthew have anything to say briefly on this topic. Is this a real concern, or is it a manufactured concern?
No, it's a very real concern. The current reward for being a successful miner or validator on the Bitcoin network is 6.25 Bitcoins, which at $44,000 per Bitcoin, which is what they're trading for this morning, is more than $300,000 for 10 minutes worth of work, which explains why around the globe you've got millions of high-powered computers running 24/7 in very large buildings, in very large banks, using all the energy to run the computers and to cool the buildings and the ongoing electricity, which is a drain on the power grid, equivalent to that of, I think, the latest data from the Cambridge study says it's equivalent to Lithuania, the entire country. That's a lot of power. And that's the environmental cost, that it takes so much power to run these farms. I think over time, not with regard to Bitcoin particularly, but the move away from proof of work to proof of stake and other kinds of consensus protocols is going to help resolve that. But it is an issue. And you're seeing some countries saying we're not going to approve, we're not going to allow exchanges to trade in new crypto assets that use proof of work, simply because of the potential for environmental costs.
Yeah, and I'd add to that. I think it's something that we should be thinking about, but there are a couple of things in that need to be examined as well. So there is energy usage, but energy is a question of itself too. We've seen states in the US like Texas that have looked to minimize some of that energy usage using off-peak time. You can see if that energy usage is being brought by coal-fired plants or renewable sources itself. And we're seeing some movement in kind of the blockchain crypto community to be looking for more energy efficient ways of doing it. But I think an important part of this analysis too is a lot of times when you hear the criticisms of the energy consumption of crypto, you hear it without any consideration for the potential benefit of crypto as well. You only hear the negative. Crypto is going to destroy the environment, and there's no benefit to what is happening. Everything is a cost-benefit analysis on this, and you cannot understate the potential benefits and what is coming from the use of crypto as well when you're also considering the costs.
Right. I want to make sure we underscore the point about what is different between a cryptocurrency as a commodity or a security or something that has in some ways become delinked from currency, right? I mean, because when I first learned about and started writing about Bitcoin 8 years ago, I definitely thought of it as a currency, but clearly somehow because of the value, because it's growing, you're probably more likely to think of it as a commodity. But what is a stable coin? I know this has been mentioned here. And why is the government kind of looking to have a greater role in a stable coin cryptocurrency than perhaps a Bitcoin currency? Anyone?
I can start
Please.
there.
Yeah.
So a stable coin is a crypto coin that is pegged to a specific, generally fiat currency. It could be a basket of currencies. So you have a stable coin that is meant to replicate the value of $1. And what you get out of that, as opposed to Bitcoin, where the price, or Bitcoin, anything else, where the price can vary quite a bit, you have a substitute for a currency that you would be using in everyday life. But with a stable coin, the idea is that that stable coin can be used then outside of the current US financial payment system in order to conduct transactions. And there's benefits to that. One, the US financial payment system is slow, it's expensive, and it's really only available to people that have bank accounts. And there's unfortunately a substantial number of people in the United States that are unbanked, and that don't have easy access or don't want easy access to the banking system. Stable coins represent an option for the future in order to transact for those people. They also offer an option in order to send money cross-border, which is very difficult these days and expensive. And stablecoins offer some opportunity to make that process easier and cheaper in the future. Right now, stablecoins are mostly used to transact crypto purchases when crypto exchanges.
Yeah.
But when we talk about these technologies, it's important to talk about their potential uses as well.
Okay. Carol and Matthew, I think you said something about this. I just want to make sure we round out this topic. Is there something unique that policy-wise that gets raised when we're talking about stable coins versus other types of cryptocurrencies?
Yeah, I think there is. One of the issues is the first huge stable coin that raised eyebrows was actually when it was Facebook rather than Meta, and they announced that they were going to create a stable coin. And Facebook had, 7 billion users, and all of a sudden there was a potential for a stable coin that could become so big that it could actually be a threat to financial stability. Now, Facebook has scaled back, and finally, a couple of weeks ago, announced that it was abandoning the project altogether. But other stable coins have arisen. And in particular, you've got Tether. And Tether is huge, not because it is the largest market capitalization or most heavily valued or invested in crypto asset, but it is the most heavily exchanged. The trading value, the daily volume of trades that are done through Tether exceeds that of Bitcoin, of Ether. It is just used to facilitate transactions. And there is now enough value, enough equivalent in fiat currency value in this market that if Tether suddenly collapsed, went from $1 to nothing because, oh my gosh, they lied, they don't have the assets backing it up, that could create profound ripples through the financial system. Tether is worth has a market capitalization way over $50 billion. US dollar, the second size one, is also over 50 billion. They are big enough to potentially cause disruptions to our financial system. Since these assets are supposedly backed by other assets, it would be nice if we knew for sure, based on independent auditors, that they really were backed, and they were backed by assets that were secure. And that's especially a concern because Tether lied. Tether originally said that it was backed dollar for dollar by US dollars, and it was not. And then it said it was 75% backed by US dollars, and it was not. It's 2.9% backed by US dollars and 67% backed by undifferentiated commercial paper. That for most of these kinds of systems, you'd expect to see a listing of what commercial paper.
Right.
And Tether has refused to release that information because it wasn't part of the narrow settlement that they entered into with the New York Attorney General when they got sued for not revealing and not being honest about their backing. It is the risk to the financial stability, and it is the history, I think, with Tether and Facebook that has prompted increased regulatory scrutiny, concern, and different kinds of issues that we don't see with other non-asset-backed cryptos.
We have a question here from Lisa Fearing. Are there any estimates of bandwidth overhead that will be required on broadband networks for settlement if crypto becomes common currency? Who would like to take that question?
I mean, I would just go out on a limb and say there's no real additional bandwidth required than the normal computation that you would do on a computer. If you're going to be transacting using cryptocurrencies, there's no real additional lag on the system. What can be a little bit more of a power drain or require more computing power is if you're going to run a node, or if you're going to have a lot of computational power that's part of the validation of that. But any normal consumer or normal business shouldn't see any sort of uptick in required bandwidth for processing transactions.
We're having multiple conversations in the chat stream, and that's good. Thank you for your discussions. One of them is from Sarah Cheeverton, and this goes, I think, to the point Carol was making about how back Tether was with currency, but wouldn't auditing, assuming it would be required by someone, present the kind of oversight that is described as problematic, perhaps start a slippery slope? I mean, this does kind of raise a question here. Carol, is the problem not enough regulation or too much regulation, right? How do we distinguish between the good regulation of crypto blockchain and the bad overreaching regulation of crypto?
Yeah, that is the issue. I'm not opposed to regulation. What I would like is regulation that balances between the need to protect the system, protect the structure, protect against the bad actors, without stifling the potential value of the underlying technology. And for example, when you look at the approach taken by the SEC, which is regulate, force it into these rules and regulations and disclosure regimes that we've had since 1934 and 1940, versus the CFTC, which says, okay, we have overarching principles. We've got 23 of them, such as fairness of access and no market manipulation. And you create a system, you create the structure that enables you to comply with those. We will let you self-certify, we'll come in and do oversight. I so much favor the CFTC's vision, which strikes me as a much more balanced approach. When I have said I'm not in favor of the current regulatory structure, don't take that as me saying, oh, no regulation, because I don't believe that. I believe in balanced regulation, and I'm just afraid that we haven't achieved that yet.
Carol, you still with me?
Hey, I guess I froze. On my screen, you all froze.
Yeah.
I'm with you, but now they look frozen.
Maybe we're frozen on their side.
This is Sarah, who just asked the question, and while half the screen is frozen, I'll just say thank you for that feedback about the policy. I can, it's a very interesting conversation about that, and I'm interested to know what Jennifer, is that right? Whoop, they're
Jennifer
gone.
Schultz.
Yeah, what her view is, since she's coming more from a very strong libertarian view. Would it be different? But she's gone now, so I don't know what she would say. They'll be back.
Well, while we're here, any more questions from you guys? I'm happy to take them.
Oh, there they are.
Maybe. Looks like they're throwing up their hands saying, I can't understand what they're saying.
I think they're muted.
Now we are unmuted.
We are unmuted. Welcome back. So on the stablecoin front, my colleague Norbert Michel and I have proposed regulation on stablecoins that answers the question of, are stablecoins backed in the way that they say they're being backed? We would like stablecoin issuers to disclose their reserves and to set down some ground rules about what are in fact short-term reserves that are appropriate for an issuer. So we're also not interested in saying, no regulation is appropriate in this space, but regulation should be appropriately tailored to the problem that you're looking to solve.
Okay.
And I think that you can do that in such a way that is not creating the slippery slope that we all fear.
We've got just 5 minutes remaining, and I want to make sure we get to some of these other, let's call them non-cryptocurrency blockchain issues. Okay, so Matthew, I want to turn to you to address the NFT question, which of course stands for non-fungible token. But what exactly is an NFT, and how does it relate to the blockchain and to the cryptocurrency, that is to say a fungible token? What's the difference there?
Well, as we talked about, fungible in this sense means I give you $5 and you would take $5. You know, I give you 10, you take 2 5s back. Money is pretty fungible. A non-fungible token in this sense is essentially a one-of-a-kind piece of what we would call a coded contract on top of the blockchain. So as we talked before, blockchain is the foundation for all these third-party, third type of applications that get put on there. And NFTs are a part of that kind of code. They're a part of a new kind of application that gets used. And that's why they're so exciting. If Kim Kardashian came out with Kim Kardashian coin, you can't really do anything with the coin. But if she came out with 100 different pictures of herself that you could have a one-of-one version of, and you had all the licensing rights to that, because on the smart contract and in the code, you could get all that validated because of blockchain, then that might be something that's more interesting. And so that's why non-fungible tokens are really cool. They're providing a massive opportunity for adoption within this ecosystem, where some people were like, owning a coin, it seems weird, I don't know why, maybe it's an investment, maybe it's not. And all of a sudden you're able to participate in additional ways. Bored Ape Yacht Club is a really good example. And people kind of say like, well, it's just a picture of an ape, why are they selling for $300,000? The truth is the utility isn't just about the picture. It's about buying in to an ecosystem where you get massive opportunities to connect with celebrities, get additional access to parties. Last year during a certain event, if you had a Bored Ape Yacht Club in your wallet, you could go on a yacht and go party with people just because you had one. And so they've got all these new mechanisms where they're building tons of organizations and mechanisms for people to engage with brands and in a new marketable way. And that's why it's really exciting.
I'll point out that while it is theoretically possible to put all of those intellectual property ownership rights on the smart contracts, very seldom do they actually appear. The NFT right now, in almost all cases, all it does is it provides title to a digital file, and not one that you control. It's maintained someone else. It's just like, oh dear, are they gone again? It's just like a record. Like if you had a deed to a house, you don't have the house, you got the deed, you got the piece of paper saying I own it.
I call it like a digital certificate of authenticity.
Yeah, and one of the things that has happened is there are some people out there who misunderstand what they are buying. They think they are buying all of those associated rights to display and use and commercialize, and that is not necessarily the case. That's one of the big issues with NFTs. What am I buying when I buy one? And it's not always clear. Normally you need a side agreement that's not part of the blockchain to actually illustrate what your underlying rights are. So the guy who bought Beeple's contract through Christie's also has a side agreement from Christie's and Beeple's giving the commercial rights over the entire work of art, which is why it was worth $69 million. The group who paid $300,000 for Dune, they paid for an original copy of Dune. They didn't get anything other than the right to display the ownership. They didn't, they don't own Frank Herbert's copyright.
Well, our conversations have merged just in time for us to conclude. So in the hopes that we don't get interrupted again, let me ask each of you for your final thoughts on cryptocurrency generally, but perhaps let me re-ask the question I'd love to hear each of you answer, which is, how far along are we in the development of other blockchain style applications beyond cryptocurrencies? What's next in terms of the blockchain beyond cryptocurrency? And let's just go in the same order that we went in, Carol, Jennifer, and Matthew.
I think we are at blockchain, what they're calling 4.0, which is the adoption by major institutional users. So it's the Walmarts of the world developing applications that really have nothing to do with assets, but are authenticity and supply chain tracing and regulatory compliance to make sure that things are safe for food, drug, carbon offsets, all sorts of things. So I think we are way beyond just crypto assets. Our regulation, however, is still focused on how do we regulate crypto assets, because those have not gone away.
Thank you. And thank you for being with us, Carol. Jennifer.
Yeah, I think we're still at the very beginning of these applications of this technology. We start talking about what's going to happen with Web 3.0, the metaverse, all of these new phrases that we throw around that have more or less meaning depending on who you're talking to. And I think that's just a sign that we're at an exciting new time in this technological development. I don't have a lot of great predictions about where we're going, and I think that's what's fun about it, and it's what's important to make sure that we're not throwing up regulatory barriers that stop this change dead in its tracks. And that's what I'm hoping we're going to start seeing out of the regulators at this point, is some understanding that their foot dragging or historical view on their regulation might be hampering future development.
Okay, thank you. And thank you for being with us. Matthew, you get the last word here.
I think the biggest piece of adoption here is going to be ease of access and use for people. And that's going to be something that's going to allow for that continued adoption and proliferation. Additional pieces like NFT and Web 3.0 are all other mechanisms that people can use to participate in this economy. You're going to be seeing brands, large brands. Nike's already buying organizations that are making shoes in the metaverse, right? You've got really, really cool ways that brands and organizations are going to start bridging both virtual and digital worlds for their consumers and provide amazing new experiences. You get a ticket to the Super Bowl, you're going to get a ticket, it's going to have a QR code on it, and you're going to get this amazing, cool Super Bowl NFT as part of your experience. And those are the things that you're going to see. I'm really excited about, especially this year and in the coming years, just massive adoption.
Well, thank you so much to each of our panelists, and participants who are in person with us here at CLIDES or remote, and to our sponsors. Reminder that we'll be back again next Wednesday at 12 noon Eastern time for a discussion on the state broadband officials and the infrastructure surge. Until next week, and on behalf of our great guests, Carol, Jennifer, and Matthew, I'm Drew Clark, and we'll see you next week. Take care.
Thanks, Drew.